Milei on economic issues. The definition of inflation. You might ask, how is the definition of inflation an economic issue? One of the timeless tools of charlatans is to distort the definition of words. Not surprisingly, therefore, Marxists and Keynesians are great at distorting the definition of words. And the definition of inflation determines how you think about inflation. A well-known technique of both lawyers and debaters is that if you get to define the issue, you have won half the debate, which Milei clearly understands as he demonstrates in these clips.
Having said this, we went to control the amount of money because in our perspective, inflation is not the increase in prices, but inflation is the loss of the purchasing power of money. If I take the first definition, inflation is fought with price controls. If the definition is the second, it is fought with monetary policy. In the first, it is the fault of the entrepreneurs, of the consumers, of the unionists. In the other, it is the fault of the politicians, or of the politicians who base themselves in the central bank. This is not a minor issue, and we made that bet.
Milei clearly demonstrates the importance of the definition of inflation. If you say the definition of inflation is a general increase in prices, then you blame businesses, unions, and landlords for raising their prices. But if you define inflation as a loss of purchasing power, then it's clear that monetary emission is the cause of inflation, which is either caused by central banks or by printing money. And, by the way, this is completely consistent with Milei's definition of money, which is that it is an indirect good. Thus, it is subject to supply and demand. If there's too much supply, that is money printing, then the value will go down. Milei demonstrates how important he thinks this issue is when he repeats almost the same arguments in this next speech.
Because it is the foundation on which we think about this problem. We are convinced about the monetary nature of inflation. That is, inflation for us is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon, generated by an excess of money supply, either because the supply goes up or because the demand falls, or because both things happen at the same time, and that generates a loss of the purchasing power of money. That is, and all the prices expressed in monetary units go up. That is our diagnosis. Now, given this background, as we are proposing this, there are other professionals who consider that inflation is multifaceted and all that kind of thing. The truth is that they are hypotheses to which I did not adhere. But that is part of another discussion. I come to tell you how we see it, what we are doing, and then those who really understand, who end up writing the story as it unfolds. The question is, where does this hypothesis come from? I mean, how do we look at this problem? From my point of view, the first thing we have to do is to not define inflation as the increase in prices, but the loss of purchasing power of money. Because if the problem is the increase in prices, the usual pitfalls appear, which have been failing for more than 4,000 years, trying to control prices.
Here, Milei shows that the improper definition of inflation leads to the conclusion that price controls will work. Over thousands of years of history, every attempt at price controls has failed spectacularly. But these Keynesians and Marxists will try again because they're charlatans. This incorrect definition of inflation is typical of Keynesians. It confuses cause with effect. The cause is the increase in money supply. The effect is the increase in prices. but this obviously incorrect definition gives more power to the state and politicians, which is why they perpetuate this fraud. Another lie, where the Keynesians confuse cause with effect, is that they claim that recessions are caused by a lack of demand, which violates the obvious principle that something has to be produced before it can be consumed. This crazy suggestion by Keynesians implies that everybody has everything they want and that they're not willing to spend their money and go out and buy anything. This completely turns economics on its head. The desire for things is always infinite. It is government interference in the market that causes recessions. Imagine buying into Keynesian economics on a deserted island like Robinson Crusoe. Robinson thinks, I'm not rich because I'm not consuming enough. Thus, to increase demand, he consumes all his fresh water, eats all his food, and then shortly thereafter dies. That's what happens to Keynesian economies over and over. That's the empirical evidence. Another problem with definitions in economics is the very definition of what economics is. Supposedly, economics deals with the question of what are the scarce resources available to society, and how are these resources allocated among competing uses. First of all, scarce resources are not available to society. They're available to their owners, those who created them or traded for them. How are these resources allocated? It depends on how the owners decide to consume them or trade them. It's got nothing to do with the government or society. This very definition of the core questions in economics leads to a socialist bias and attitude, and shows once again the power of definitions. By defining economics this way, the socialists and Keynesians are able to bias the whole argument in their favor. Long live freedom, damn it.